and welcome to another Anatomy Whiteboard walkthrough. Today's subject is scapular anastomosis, and I've also included some bonus material at the end. Hey everybody, we're back, and today we're going to look at the scapular anastomosis. So an anastomosis is when there are arteries that actually connect to each other. We're talking about collateral supply today, and I really just want to address and sort of make a full picture for you of why we care about the scapular circumflex artery that we learned about in the last video at all. Why is it there? What's it doing between the two teres muscles? So the first thing I'm going to do, I'm going to draw out the bones of our shoulders. So I'm going to have an anterior and a posterior shoulder, and I'm going to have the proximal humerus, the top of the humerus, the scapula, as well as a little portion of the clavicle, so that we can kind of superimpose those arteries on top of that. Now, I'm giving you a version of these drawings. It's going to be better than the one I do today, that is downloadable, printable, uploadable, so that you can use it and practice your arteries on top of that drawing. You can see I'm printing it off here, and I'm changing the setting to landscape to make it larger, and then for some reason it wants to print a blank second page, so I'm turning that off, so it's only going to print the first page. You can always download and resize these images because they are vector images, which just means essentially they can be resized to literally any size and retain their quality, just like the other ones I gave you. Now, you don't just have to use that for arteries. You could use that for the muscles in this area, the nerves in this area, the arteries, the veins, whatever you are studying. You can use that area for whatever you like. So that's there for you. Now let's jump in, and I'm going to draw those anterior and posterior versions. So we got our anterior and posterior clavicle, part of it, humerus, proximal portion, anterior, posterior. We got scapula, anterior, posterior. So we are set up for our next drawing. So what we're focusing in on today is actually the axillary artery and giving off that circumflex scapular, and we want to connect it to other things we know and see why it exists in the first place, because from our axillary artery branches video, we learned that it goes and ducks behind the lateral border of our scapula, but we didn't actually follow it. And following something is actually a really great way to fully understand anatomy, because it's all about relationships, and there's always a why for why something is where it is. So we are going to draw in our axillary artery here, and then we are going to focus in, this is where it kind of becomes brachial. So I'm going to put a little dotted line there, but it still exists. Brachial is going to split. Okay, so this part is axillary. In our third portion of our axillary artery, which is going to be about here. Why? Because our pec minor attaches from our coracoid process of our scapula to our third through fifth ribs anteriorly. And so it's going to cut right across here, which means our second portion is ish in this area. This is the start of our third portion. So we're going to have a big branch off of our third portion called the subscapular trunk. This is our subscapular trunk that's going to give off branches to your subscapularis, which sits inside of this shallow indent, the circumflex scapular artery, which is the one we're going to follow, as well as a review, the thoracodorsal artery. So this one, though, is our circumflex scapular artery. I'll put a little star in it. This one, though, is the circumflex scapular artery. I put a star in it, and we're going to follow it to the back side, because it left our anterior picture, but it didn't just go away. It actually ends up on the back. They don't just disappear. So continuing on our posterior surface, I'm going to add in a little bit of the axillary artery as well. So we're going to see this axillary artery kind of like this from the back. You don't see it from the back. It is there, technically. It's just deeper. And we're giving off this big honking subscapular trunk that gave off the thoracodorsal artery to our latissimus dorsi muscle, as well as this circumflex scapular. And on this side, it's actually going to be traveling like this. So this is our circumflex scapular on the other side, and it is going on to the scapula. When we talk about it in terms of lab, we're going to talk about finding the circumflex scapular artery that came off of our axillary artery actually in our posterior shoulder between our teres heads. So we have two teres muscles. Teres major and teres minor. Now I've exaggerated the window in between the two because normally they're so close together, they're touching, and you have to pull them apart. Or sometimes even in lab, in a very muscular person, they're going to be fused together with some fascia and actually some muscle fibers. It just depends on the individual. But if you can peel them apart and see any kind of artery, even if it's just a cut artery, so it's a lumen, a hole, you can tell it's a tube and it's curly and it's artery-like, that's going to be a part of your circumflex scapular artery that we can see just for a minute in between those two teres muscles. So why is it here? Well, it's here because it's going to supply these teres muscles with some blood, and it's also going to be a part of an anastomosis. An anastomosis is a connection of multiple arteries to create collateral supply. We call it an anastomosis, which is one of the best words. So we have this circumflex scapular artery coming in, but who is it meeting up with? Well, it's all the other scapular arteries you heard of, but probably didn't think about in terms of anything other than them supplying the muscles you learned. So let's look at them. So axillary artery, I kind of touched on this before and in the other video. Under the clavicle, it used to be called subclavian. Subclavian artery becomes axillary artery when it enters the axilla, when it passes the first rib/clavicle, because subclavian means below clavicle. So we have this subclavian artery, and we probably haven't gotten here yet unless your curriculum did head and neck first. Then you may have already learned these branches, but if your curriculum did not, we're going to talk about some new things. So your axillary artery, which is totally at the wrong angle here, let me fix that, is going to come through this area, and the subclavian artery is up here. Subclavicle, right? So it's running under the clavicle. So there's our subclavian artery on our posterior surface. So subclavian artery is actually going to give off a trunk. We're going to kind of put a trunk here, but I'm just going to draw one of its branches. One of its branches is going to head this direction posteriorly. It's going to give off some branches. It's going to dive through a little hole and give off some more branches down here. So this artery that I just drew in is called suprascapular artery. So this is suprascapular artery. We know this artery. We know it goes and supplies the muscles sitting in these fossa, which are going to be the supraspinatus and the infraspinatus, which runs in the exact same direction the infraspinatus does as the teres minor. So they share the same action, but that's for a different video. So supraspinatus and infraspinatus are supplied by suprascapular artery. And suprascapular artery is coming down to this area, and circumflex scapular artery is already in this area, and you can guarantee that they're going to meet up. They're going to connect to one another, forming an anastomosis. What is an anastomosis's purpose? Well, it's to provide collateral circulation. So if something were to happen to my suprascapular artery, my circumflex scapular artery, and one other artery we haven't discussed yet, can still provide some blood. Is it enough blood? No. Is it temporarily enough blood? Yes. We'll get into that at the end. The other artery, you may have already thought of it by now because we're talking about scapular arteries, circumflex, supra, and lastly, dorsal scapular. So dorsal scapular comes from subclavian as well. It's actually very variable though. It doesn't always come from subclavian, but it always branches in this direction to give blood to muscles in this area. So dorsal scapular comes down the back, the dorsal surface, along the medial border of the scapula, and supplies blood to the muscles we learned about maybe day 1, day 2, that are the levator scapulae and the rhomboid muscles. So levator scapulae, rhomboid minor, rhomboid major are all supplied by the dorsal scapular artery, and that artery, because of where it is and its proximity to these other arteries, is actually going to connect to the suprascapular artery, to the circumflex scapular artery, and now you can really see the connection. It's making a circle, or it is creating connection between all of these arteries. So there's something happened. You have a clot just in your suprascapular artery. Well, then dorsal scapular and circumflex scapular can provide temporary blood to the infraspinatus and the supraspinatus by routing it this direction instead. Now, I'm going to stop there and talk about the reality of that. So the reality of that is, let's say you have a clot. Let's say it's in our suprascapular artery. I'll draw it in. It'll be purple for some reason. This part was already narrow anyway. So you have a clot, which means this artery no longer is supplying blood. Problematic. Now, if the reason this is not supplying blood is because a clot suddenly blocked the entire artery, these arteries are not enough to keep those muscles well supplied. Maybe for a few minutes. I don't know the actual timing of that, but I know it is not enough, and it will not help you long term. Whereas, if this clot forms over time, slowly you are narrowing this area, and your body is able to compensate, it will actually increase the diameter of the blood vessels that go to support and supply that anastomosis, because this one is narrowing and getting smaller. So if it's a chronic thing, or it is a long-term development of a clot or an injury or something or other, then you're going to actually be able to change the size of the other arteries and compensate for that, which is really cool. And your collateral supply really will supply your supra and infraspinatus. But in the acute sort of scenario, it's a very temporary fix, and then it's not going to have enough blood because these arteries that connect them are just not big enough to provide enough blood to those muscles. Now we do it super speed style, again with arrows for my drawing averse viewers using those downloadable outlines. So we draw on the axillary artery, which came from the subclavian and exits the axilla as the brachial, giving off the deep brachial in the arm. We're going to add our subclavian and our axillary to the other side as well. And then we're going to look at that third portion, giving off the subscapular trunk, which gives off our thoracodorsal artery to the latissimus dorsi muscle, as well as the circumflex scapular. And we can actually see it on the back side, giving blood to the teres minor and major. And then we can see our suprascapular giving blood to our supraspinatus and infraspinatus. And finally, the dorsal scapular giving blood to our levator scapulae, our rhomboid major and minor. All three of those arteries connect in some way, creating the scapular anastomosis. Oh, what's this? Bonus material! Let's draw out those shoulder muscles. I'm using the downloadable drawings from the YouTube description to do these, so you can too. Let's start with our teres major. When I draw out muscles, I can practice attachments, actions, innervations, and blood supply. The options are endless. So we start with teres major on the posterior surface, which attaches from the inferior angle of the scapula to the bicipital groove, the medial lip, if you get specific, anteriorly. The teres minor is just superior to it, but stays 100% posterior from scapula to posterior aspect of the greater tubercle of the humerus. The teres minor and the infraspinatus share the same attachments. The infraspinatus is just above the teres minor and sometimes is blended with it. From the infraspinatus fossa to the greater tubercle as well, this means they are going to have the same actions because they run in the same muscle fiber direction. Supraspinatus exists above the spine and the scapula in the supraspinous fossa to attach laterally to the top of the greater tubercle of the humerus, so it can abduct the humerus the first 15 degrees of abduction. Then anteriorly, the subscapularis attached from the large anterior subscapular fossa to the lesser tubercle of the humerus, meaning it's the only rotator cuff muscle, the sits muscles, that attaches to something other than the greater tubercle, the lesser tubercle. Lastly, I added in the latissimus dorsi superior attachment because it's pretty cool to see the relationship between the lat, teres major, and pec major. There is a silly little saying that helps people remember where those three muscles attach in relation to each other. A lady between two majors. The lat is the lady that is sandwiched between the pec major, which attaches to the bicipital groove's lateral lip, or edge, and the teres major, which attaches to the medial lip, or edge, of the bicipital groove. The lat attaches to the medial lip as well, but is found superficial to the teres major attachment. So the two majors sandwich a lady. I only added the lat to my drawing, but you could add the pec major or whatever else you need to study. And lastly, after you do this drawing, make sure you add innervation. Make sure you add actions. Make sure you add to your foundation. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you are liking these videos, please subscribe to the channel, like the videos, and tell your friends. In the comments, you can always let me know what subject you want me to do next. Happy studies!